Good afternoon, my family. We usually don't go live in the middle of the day like this, but we just have a great opportunity to share some culture with you. When I say culture, you might be thinking about singing and dancing. That's a part of culture, but the critical culture, the culture of deep thought about our present and our future. And this is, I would argue that this, I'm saying many people, including my guests that I'll introduce in a minute, would agree that this is an integral part of our culture, and that's the part that often gets overlooked, um, which has given birth to some of the other things that we love so much. So I'm going to give you a chance to like and share the video. We're on live here in the beautiful country of Guyana. I'm at home. We've been here for the whole month of August. It's Emancipation Month. Just going to give you a brief moment. And in the background, you hear the sounds of a man who gave us a real soundtrack to our life as Guyanese people, as Caribbean people, Mr. Dave Martin, who made his transition just yesterday, I believe. So like and share the video. Like and share the video, and let your family know we're on. You know, we always count it a blessing when we can have some meaningful discourse again about our lives, you know. And today we're joined by a brother who I only recently met, but his reputation goes before him. And I know that we have some common links to our family from a longer time. He is someone that, as I have gone around the country, even with my sisters and brothers on old fire stick catch quick tour. You know, Caribbean people and Guyanese people are very much a part of that. I always want to talk about the politics of the day and to talk about what's wrong. And oftentimes you get the opportunity to talk about solutions. You're definitely going to hear about what's wrong, but often you could also hear about what solutions, you know, and this brother's name has come up as we have discussed what's happening in the country. You know, I saw him at the 1st of August gathering in Buxton, the village of my birth. The eve of the 1st of August, actually the 31st, the night of the 31st, going into the 1st of August, is always traditionally a gathering in Buxton and many of the other African villages that really speaks to the continuity of our self-care, you know, in some really fundamental ways. There's so much to talk about, so I don't want to belabor. I want to thank you all for joining, and again, ask you to like and share the video so that the family can know we're on. Of course, we're going to live on the social media spaces, but more importantly, we're doing this for WRFG Radio. This is my 29th year on the radio, and our program is called The Ancestral Rock. We are on from 2 to 4 every Thursday afternoon. So without any further ado, I want to welcome to the airwaves of WRFG 89.3 in Atlanta, and of course all around the world at WRFG.org, our brother attorney Nigel Hughes. Good afternoon, yeah. Good afternoon, beloved.
Good afternoon, Russ. How are you? My apologies for having you wait. I got delayed in court trying to assist a brother who was in difficulty. Are you hearing me clearly?
There's some kind of delay
Are,
from me, but
are you hearing me clearly?
hearing you clearly. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you. I was saying
All
my
right.
apologies for keeping your listeners waiting. I got delayed in court. I was trying to assist somebody who was in some difficulty.
As your reputation says that you do often, time and time again. So we're grateful for that. The listeners weren't waiting, so there's no worry about that. We just took the opportunity. Usually we go live on Facebook, so all is. So I want to ask you, Brother Nigel, just to get started, as I was saying, as I've gone around the country, and I'm not just saying this because you're in our presence, your name keeps coming up in terms of, I would use the word players, factors in this political reality in this time here. Everyone is talking about what is happening with Guyana, and for many different reasons. So, funny enough, I named this program Country for Sale with a question mark. Uh, and so we're going to put attorney Nigel Hughes on the witness stand and see if he could give us some evidence, either in the affirmative or to the contrary, that the country is for sale. It was something that you said that really struck me, and I was speaking even with my sisters and brothers who came with me to Guyana on the country, that really struck them too when you were just talking about some of the development, as you were speaking in Buxton on the 31st, some of the developments that are happening in terms of the building up of this infrastructure. And it really sent chills through us because we know so well in the United States context about what we call gentrification. They use that word in Guyana, where communities are made lush and sexy and built up over time through different nefarious means often. And then we find out a year later that this was not being done for the people who live there. This is not being done for grandmother, grandfather who have lived there for 3 or 4 decades. For instance, in Atlanta, where I live, this happens time and time again, where you have elders who have owned their homes since the 60s, but they live on a fixed income. So what will happen is people come in and raise the taxes, and they do things. They will sell one house for an astronomical amount, which raises the property value and therefore raises the taxes. And then these elders who are on a fixed income cannot any longer afford the taxes, and so grandmama loses her house, who she's had in the family for such a long time. So there's so much we want to talk about, but first of all, again, thank you for joining us. I want to ask you, for those of us who don't know so much about you, I have audience here on WRFG that is a global audience, and many people do not really know about Guyana except for hearing one or two things. Maybe they might have heard about Jim Jones. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that people will still ask you when you ask them, but oh, you're talking about that place where Jim Jones went. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your program. I really appreciate this. It's always difficult to talk about yourself. I'll give you some of the basics. I'm a true Guyanese, true son of the soil. I've not lived anywhere else other than a short stint when I went to university in the UK. I've lived in Guyana for all my life. I went to school in Guyana, went to primary school, secondary school, did sixth form. After sixth form, went to University College London, did my first and second degrees there, got called to the bar, practiced for a while, came back home, and I've been practicing home since. I came back to Ghana in 1988. Started practicing with my father's firm, Hughes, Hughes and Stobie, and got very actively involved in politics at the time. During school, I was very closely associated with the Working People's Alliance. I was a Rodney follower, followed your eminent father. When I was a student, actually, Walter got assassinated while I was doing O levels, and I remember finishing my maths exams and joining the protest march that day, going down the street. Came back in the late 80s, 1988. When I got back in Guyana, we were going through a difficult time, the Economic Recovery Program, which the International Monetary Fund had imposed upon the country. And there was a big issue still at that time in relation to free and fair elections, and got involved in what was at that time, I think, a movement called GUARD, which was sort of a political protest movement calling for free and fair elections. 1992 came and went. Dr. Jagan got elected before the end of his term. People were disappointed with what they hoped would have been the changes that would have taken place. That would have been all embracing and all encompassing. It was not. And after he passed, it sort of rapidly went downwards, very, very rapidly went downwards. He was succeeded by his wife. As you know, his wife, Miss Janet Jagan, was not Guyanese. She had been in the political struggle for a long time in Guyana. She had a difficult 2 or 3 years. There were lots of protests. The elections were disputed in 97. We went back to elections again. We then got a young president called Jack Dio. Again, people had hopes at the time that he would have been different. He turned out to be not much different. As a matter of fact, he turned out to be a lot worse than fears people had. He stayed there, and he has been the dominant political force for the People's Progressive Party since. I practiced, and I've been practicing here, doing a lot of human rights work, do a lot of work. I do a lot of work for the indigenous community. Actually, I started doing a lot of work for the indigenous community and their land rights. We just finished a case that took 25 years and finally got vindicated that they were entitled to this is the Akawayo and the Arakuna peoples, that they were entitled to their lands in the Upper Mazaruni area. The state has appealed that decision. And we saw some really egregious trespasses on the human rights, particularly of African males. There was a crime wave in which in excess of 400 African males were killed, no inquest, no charges, no investigation, no commission of inquiry, nothing at all, washed under the table, so to speak. And there was a period where the law enforcement agencies literally killed young African males with impunity. As a matter of fact, the one assassination, and I call it an assassination, was that triggered, I think, the crime wave, was the killing of Shaka Blair. Shaka Blair in Buxton, you probably know Shaka Blair.
My good brother.
Right. He, one of the officers went into his house and shot and killed him in front of his wife and children. Unarmed, without any lawful excuse. And that, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back. After that, the country descended into real chaos, in which we saw further abuses. While that was going on, there was what you call the transfer of state assets from the state to supporters of the ruling party, which are essentially are one ethnic domination. Guyana, as you know, politics in Guyana has been racially divided, continues to be racially divided. And so a lot of state assets were transferred to supporters of the ruling party at knockdown prices. Same effect as gentrification. And as a consequence, after that, as the country progressed, not only did they transfer assets, contracts only got awarded to people who were supporting the ruling party, who were predominantly one ethnic group. And so the imbalance between the ethnic groups became even greater. And after the discovery of oil, and this present government got back in 2020, it just went over the top. So right now we're earning as a country 65 million Ghana dollars an hour, $1.4 billion a day. And yeah, exactly. And 90% of the contracts that are given out for infrastructural development, for bridges, for building schools, all of those are going to one ethnic group. I actually did some research called Economy and Justice about 2, 3 years ago. And what that disclosed at the time was that, for example, the oil blocks offshore, those that didn't go to multinationals, all of the rest went to one ethnic group. Of the 6 export gold licenses that are issued by the state, 5 of the 6 are issued to one ethnic group. Of the state contracts for the supply of medical supplies, all of them go to one ethnic group. Um, in the water industry, similar situation. Only 18% of the contracts for road construction went to Africans, all the rest went to one ethnic group. And when you come to the indigenous community, it's almost as if they are invisible because they get absolutely nothing. There's not even an attempt to pretend that they're entitled. So just a week ago, I went to visit the Upper Mazaruni, and would you believe in the nursery and primary school, about 400 children, there's 6 outdoor latrines in 2024. The kids from 3 years old have to go to outdoor latrines. The school has no internal plumbing for children. Unbelievable.
Oil earns $1 billion a day in oil
And
revenue.
that's a country that's earning $1.4 billion Ghana dollars per day.
So,
It's just staggering.
yeah, you left me speechless. We're talking with attorney Nigel Hughes. You know, one of the titles that we have for some of our great attorneys in the States, especially one whose interview I was listening to today, Brother Nigel, attorney at war. We call him attorney at war, Alton Maddox. And I'm sure that through your work, you will be known as attorney at war as well. He called himself the attorney at war instead of the attorney at law, because of the conflict he had to fight, I was listening to an interview that I did with him and Dick Gregory today, the great humanist, the great
Yeah.
humanitarian, comedian, um, civil rights, human rights activist who actually passed away on this day. But in that interview, we were talking. They were giving us a live breakdown of what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri, which you remember some years ago really set off a real uprising. It shifted the energy of a new generation of activists in America. Similar to what you mentioned about what happened with the killing of Shaka Blair in Buxton. It's funny how the more things change, the more they stay the same, and we have this universal reality that we're dealing with. So again, in the effort to help our family understand Guyana a little bit more, um, from the perspective of Nigel Hughes, you mentioned something earlier in terms of when Dr. Chadi Jagan passed away, things shifted rapidly, even maybe before he passed away. I'm thinking of an African proverb that says, don't look at where you fell, but where you slipped. It may be a whole master's course. It might take days and days to explain this, but give us the condensed version. From your study of the history of our country, Guyana has never really, from my understanding, been seen as a really peaceful society, not for a long stretch of time, since the time of independence, since the time of the end of colonialism, especially the legal colonialism. But when you talk about slipping rapidly, give us some more details about what that looks like in terms of the decline. Now, a place where so many Guyanese are packing airplanes and on ships and everything to leave this country, while ironically, so many foreigners, as you alluded to the other day, are coming in to this country. I mean, it's no coincidence. We're listening to Dave Martin, who just transitioned. I was playing that song, "Not the Blade of Grass," and when I think about one of the oaths that the sovereign head of many countries in the world, I don't know if that's part of the oath of office of the president of Guyana, but it's to protect the country from foreign and domestic terrorists. So it seems that Guyana is under threat from domestic terrorists, even those who are in the seat of government. But help us understand a little bit clearer about what this decline has looked like. So it's not just something.
You just touched on something I just spoke about at a public rally on Saturday. And the theme of that presentation was don't let the looters sell you your own goods. And essentially, essentially what it was is that the wealth that we have belongs to us, and don't let the government take it and turn it around and then sell it to you as if it's theirs. It's not. But to go back a little bit, I don't know how much your readers know about the history of Guyana. I do want to point out one important fact that quite often is overlooked in Guyana, which is the 1763 uprising. The 1763 uprising preceded the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the French Revolution. And it wasn't just an uprising. In 1763, the enslaved people of Berbice actually rose up, defeated their oppressors, and ran the county of Berbice for a year. And they actually traded sugar with foreign entities and wanted to enter into an agreement with their former oppressors for them to live downriver while the revolutionaries lived upriver. So it was successful. The reason it failed wasn't as a result of their defeat by the colonialists, was the result of internal problems that led to the weakening of the revolution. The reason I mention that is that Guyana has had a long history of being quite advanced in its thinking and approach to economic models. If I fast forward all the way now to where we are today, after the discovery of oil, for the first time, the country actually had an opportunity by way of the revenues that it is generating from the sale of oil to be able to carry out the social and economic changes and transformations that are necessary to develop the country for the benefit of all people. Unfortunately, that has not happened. This government has had very, very pernicious policies that are directed only at elevating those people who are their supporters. And I just give you a couple of consequences here that you could see. Um, and I'll use an extreme example. Well, it's not, the results are extreme, but the example is not extreme. In 2022, while we're making all this oil, Guyana topped the Caribbean as the country that had the best and brightest students taking the most subjects, 24 A's. All those kids on the coast that allowed Guyana to top the CXC and got 24 A's, we did very well. In all the indigenous communities, in every single one of them, not a single student was able to get 1A. So the education system itself is so structured to create an apartheid between the students who are on the coast and are wealthy enough to afford private education and those that come from the indigenous communities who have no access to internet and who cannot even get, none of them can get a single A. In terms of the economics, the only contractors that are getting contracts to build roads are those that are closely aligned to the government. And it's so extreme that we have one situation where one contract went out for tender to build a very significant part of a highway. The engineer's estimate was exceeded by 3 times. And what the board did was strike out 26 of the 27 persons who bid And the one company that remained, they actually awarded the contract at 3 times the engineer's estimate. And of course, that sole company very closely connected to the government. So this is a sort of wholesale plunder of the national resources, going specifically to companies aligned with the government. When you come to, I mentioned gold export licenses. Like I said just now, 5 of the 6 gold export licenses go only to people of Indian descent. Um, and this goes across the economic spectrum. You have uh, business entities like Go Invest, which is responsible for attracting international investment, actually steering companies away from African Guyanese enterprises and saying only do business with these kind of companies, which are, of course, of one ethnic domination and directly connected to the government. What is happening also is because of the significant revenues that are coming into the country, house prices, land prices generally have gone through the roof. And in Georgetown, you've seen that gentrification that you mentioned earlier. So the price of land in Georgetown has become so expensive that even business houses in Guyana are finding it difficult to compete with overseas property investors to purchase land. And in areas which were traditionally owned by African Guyanese, you've already started to see the gentrification that you're talking about, because people are going in, buying out pieces of land, and of course pushes up the price. And then you realize that the entire character of neighborhoods in Georgetown are beginning to change. So we've got that happening very clearly. As a matter of fact, there are areas where the price of land in Guyana, without the utilities and benefits in the United States, is more expensive than the United States. An acre of land on the Demerara River between Georgetown and Temeri is now $1 million per acre. That's more expensive than Florida, in several parts of Florida. So what we're seeing is that Guyanese people are being pushed to the periphery of the economy. But worse than that, the next 5 years, the labor demand is going to be for skilled and semi-skilled labor to feed the oil industry. We saw a recent statistic published by the Ministry of Education that says that kids are dropping out of school at the rate of 48%, which is 1 in 2. So it means that at least 50% of the people who enter secondary school are not completing, which means they don't qualify to be either skilled or semi-skilled. So they are not going to get decent jobs, which are going to be available for the next 5 years. They're going to end up with low-end jobs. Those skilled and semi-skilled jobs are going to be filled by foreigners. So they are literally walking themselves or being walked into second-class citizenship, in which they are not even going to be able to take advantage of the oil economy simply because they don't have the skills to either start their own businesses or get the better jobs that require skilled and semi-skilled qualifications. So we are at a real crisis point, and I like what you said. When something happens, don't look at where you fell, look at where you slid. And this is where we are sliding badly, because these kids who are dropping out of school don't realize that, try as they may, the opportunities for them to have remedial classes or any sort of remedial training that will begin to give them an opportunity in the new economy don't exist. And so they literally, with the best will in the world, unless they turn to crime, are going to be second class economically, second class socially, and they're just not going to be able to take the benefit or enjoy the benefit of this newfound wealth.
Wow. I mean, that's a mouthful, an earful, a heartful, because one thing we can't argue with is facts, you know. And one thing you didn't mention that I want to bring up, just for the sake of our viewers, our listeners on WRFG Atlanta 89.3. By the way, we're speaking to attorney Nigel Hughes, is that the teachers have been on strike for a long time demanding fair wages. So not only are the children dropping out, but they're dropping out, ironically, you could say for good reason. They're not get, you know, they're, that space that is supposed to be nurturing their intellectual development is failing them tremendously. And the teachers cannot even get a pay raise. Teachers are working in substandard conditions. And all of this is in a country, again, that earns $1.4 billion a day. Talk a little bit about the teachers aspect, the teachers struggle, please.
Right. Now, in most countries that they call third world, one of the few ways out of poverty is education. And therefore, the ability to impart education to the young people is the most critical part of any form of development. Absolutely, it's been proven time and time again.
Also, one of the most esteemed professions because of that.
Absolutely. You are the son of one of our most esteemed teachers that we've had, who taught so many people that went on to become world-class leaders in their respective fields. It is, and particularly in Guyana, it was the avenue that lifted you out of poverty. But not only did it lift you out of poverty, it afforded you that acceleration so that you could find your place globally wherever your capacities could take you intellectually. And so, because that tradition has always been noble, it's always been respected, revered, I dare say, it has been important. This government that is in office now has no regard whatsoever to the teaching profession. And the reason for that position is because most of the teaching profession is African and don't traditionally support them. So they have a very hostile relationship with them. Despite their views on the teachers politically, they have not seen the link or appear not to have recognized the link, or pernicious in relation to whether they recognize it but don't wish to pay attention to it. They have not seen it necessary to give teachers any increase at all. They've not had an increase for several years. They asked the government for an increase. The government refused. They went into negotiations. The teachers said, look, pay us retroactively because you have not increased our salaries since 2018. They completely refused to do this. All the while, the sugar industry, which has been losing billions of dollars per year, they have continued to subsidize that industry and pay billions of dollars to that industry only because their supporters come from that industry. It got
Mm.
so bad that the teachers were forced to go on strike. And while they were on strike, the government proposed, and this is just absolutely astonishing. The government proposed that they that they would encourage people to set up private schools, and they would pay the private schools for the teachers to go for the students to go to. So in other words, they wanted to cut the entire basis, economic basis for the teachers. Say, look, you go set up your private schools and we will pay you. And the way that would operate is that they would only pay money to the private school operators that they choose. And this was a serious proposal from the government. So over the last week or so, they made a final offer. They went up from a 5%, 10%. They're now at 10%. They went 5, 7, 8, and then they're 10. And the teachers went back and they rejected this because, of course, the inflation rate is beyond that, and they have had the same wage for a long time. School is on recess at the moment. They go back in about 3, 4 weeks, and the teachers have rejected that offer, and I'm not sure what's going to play out. Now, the difficulty is that during the strike, the kids who are in private school, who, of course, who are better off economically, didn't suffer the same losses as those who, of course, were attending the public schools. So we have a problem. We have a real problem in the teaching profession and the way in which they're being treated. It is almost as if they're being intentionally starved so that they will abandon the profession.
Mm. talking to Attorney Nigel Hughes. One of the things I've witnessed some interviews with you from time to time, especially with our brother David Hines. One of the things I appreciate about your presentation is how you always share the facts. You know, this allows people to draw conclusions for themselves. So in that vein, I want to ask you some more questions just to help us really, the international community, really locate Guyana in the geopolitical world, especially as it relates to the United States. So maybe you can help us to demystify a little bit of this, you know, because street talk is street talk and based on fact, or there might be a little bit of fact with a little bit of fiction. So one thing we know for sure, one of the old adages, one of the old sayings is that when America sneezes, the Caribbean catches a cold. When America sneezes, the Caribbean catches a cold. Now, interestingly enough, there have been some rumors about um, the role of the United States government in general, but even obviously since this upcoming year is an election year in the United States, there's a lot of speculation about what that potentially means for Guyana, even as it relates to the persecution of criminals in the government and all of that. How do you see all of that? I don't want to ask you to be a prophet in terms of how you see it playing out, but what do you see as that relationship between U.S. politics and Guyanese reality, the Guyanese society, as you've been attempting to explain to us, you know, basically?
Okay, so that's that's an interesting one. So American political interest has always had an impact on political outcomes in Guyana. This goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s before Guyana became independent. There was a fear that Guyana was likely to fall into the hands of the Soviets when the world was divided into two between East and West. We had a political party, the People's Progressive Party, which was a declared communist party in the day. And since then, one of the conditions for Guyana becoming independent was that we certainly didn't want to have a repeat of Cuba. So that fear has always been important for American political interest. And as we progressed through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, up to when the wall came down, I think that was the dominant thinking in the U.S. Capitol. By the time 1992 came around, actually before that, when Desmond Hoyt took over in 1985, the country was in difficult economic circumstances. We had to go to the International Monetary Fund, and as a result of that, they dictated what our policies were going to be. So there was a big privatization program that took place. So all the utilities had to get privatized, the telephone company, the electricity company. There was a big privatization drive. Also, in 1992, there was the reintroduction of free and fair elections, and the People's National Congress, which held office since 1964, were voted out. Um, the People's Progressive Party came into office in 1992. I think there was a general view that well, this was an election. It was free and fair, widely accepted as being free and fair. It was still close, and people felt that okay, hopefully the country will be able to start addressing some of its historic challenges that existed. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. But again, by that time, the world had changed significantly. So the East West dilemma wasn't there. This was a question of what would be in the best economic interest of the United States. I think that Henry Kissinger's statement that has driven American policy for so long, excuse me, America has no permanent enemy, has no permanent friends, it has permanent interests. So the question of what is its permanent interest going to be? Um, we went along. We were never geographically that significant. Our significance came after the discovery of oil in commercial quantities, which was in 2015. Then, of course, that discovery was made by one of the America's primary companies, Exxon, and of course, the U.S. government's interest would have been to protect the interests of, excuse me, one of their primary companies. Towards the end of the David Granger administration, there was a problem in Venezuela. Mr. Trump was in office in the United States of America. He had promised that there would be, excuse me, an October surprise. I believe there were invitations to the then administration to assist America in making that happen. I believe the administration was not comfortable with the request. And there was a regime change in 2020 in a disputed election. There was a regime change, and Mr. Granger was removed from power, and the People's Progressive Party was returned to power. The Democratic, excuse me, government won elections in 2020, and their focus was both commercial and human development. Given how biased the economic development in Guyana was at the time, they were concerns about how this government was actually disposing of the wealth that had come into its possession. And so there has been some indication that there are concerns about the way in which the present government is treating those that don't support them. The the present government has very close political ties with the Republican Party, and there is a view. It's been expressed, I think, in New York or by some of their supporters, that their preference, this is the present government's preference, is that you see a Republican administration in Washington. So that is where I think the current reality in Guyana is. Um,
Oh,
they,
murmuring, like people like to talk. Boy, you see, when if Kamala come in, they're gonna persecute Jack Dio.
I
Kamala and
don't know.
them.
I don't know that the American government has an interest in persecuting anybody per se. Um, what what I think happens is that there's a difference in approach and a difference in focus. So if there are unjust policies that have very unjust results, I think a Harris administration would be perhaps a lot more interested in that than a Republican administration.
You're speaking to attorney Nigel Hughes, who is not only an attorney and everything. He's also the presidential from the political party called Alliance for Change, which ironically, Brother Nigel, I'm sure you have to deal with this reality all the time in terms of your unfolding campaign. Ironically, the Alliance for Change, there was a defector from the Alliance for Change who was seen as responsible for advancing the no confidence vote, which ended up with the Granger administration having a shorter term. Um, I wonder, as we get closer into Guyana, I appreciate you. We don't have too much more time with you, but I want to really talk about some of the issues on the ground that really speak towards solution, towards these evils that you have mentioned. As I was preparing for this interview, I was reflecting on Dr. Martin Luther King's thesis about evils: racism, poverty, and war. and wondering how could we make that correlation in the Guyanese context. You know, racism, poverty, and war. You've already laid that out in many ways. Maybe not so much about the war part, but especially about racism and poverty. But one thing I wanted to acknowledge, you know, I've seen as we speak more about the solution, the possible solutions to some of this, political solutions. It was a great, at least, at very least, a symbol of strength when we witnessed yourself and Brother Aubrey Norton and Professor David Hines in Boston, you know, joining hands in a show of unity. How significant was that and is that for you beyond the symbolism of it?
How what? Sorry.
How significant was that that show that gesture? I'm asking how significant was that for you beyond even just the symbolism of it?
Well, it in the struggle to advance the rights of the working people of Guyana across the board, where political entities have common approaches against a common I don't want to use excuse me I don't want to use the word enemy, but a common oppressor. That was more than a gesture. I think it was an indication that our focus is on changing the present economic order and circumstances. And so it means that we are prepared to work together where we find common ground to remove what is clearly an oppressive regime and clearly one that follows policies that are not in the interest of the average working person in the country.
That's a beautiful thing. And to the average Guyanese person, who, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, is still very, I want to say, many people in the country still have this Moses mentality. They were looking for the leader. We're looking for the next Walter Rodney. We're looking for the next this person and that person to come and lead us. One of the legacies of Walter Rodney, ironically, even in that context, or possibly because of that reality, is, you know, he was called the prophet of self-emancipation. So what is the program outside of the removal of the, what is the youth?
I'm losing you, Kofi. You're sounding slightly faded, and I just heard what is the program, and then I didn't hear you after that.
What I'm saying, what that the concurrent, can you hear me better now?
Yeah, yeah.
To the removal of the necessary evil, so to speak. What can you say to us about some of the programs, some of your platforms, for instance, in terms of restoring the esteem of the people, you know, restoring the self-esteem of the people, where eventually, you know, there's an author, there's an African author called Aikwe Arma. He said something very profound one time. He said, you know, when true leaders, when they've done their job correctly, when they look around, they don't have a bunch of followers, but many other people ready to lead. So, you know, and we can only imagine, really, I can say we can only imagine the enormous path ahead in terms of the opposition forces like yourself, you know, and your party, in terms of removing this government that has caused such chaos in the society. And also, in terms of the building of the people, there is actually something that is a critical mass of conscious, politically, socially conscious people that are ready to create a new society. What do you see as your agenda towards those ends?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Well, a couple of things here, and they have to go in tandem. One of them is the wealth that is being generated right now is not being felt by the population. There's a complete disengage between the average man and the wealth. So we believe, first of all, at the basic economic level, there should be a direct cash transfer to each citizen based on a particular percentage of the National Resource Fund, which the economists can recommend. So the National Resource Fund is where the proceeds from the oil royalties and half of our profit sharing go. So what we need to decide is we get advised by the economists as to what percentage of that we can sustain and have transferred directly to the economy. So the impact of that is that the average citizen will then have in their hand immediate cash coming directly. Secondly, the most important thing that will elevate any citizen is to make sure that the education system, and when I say education, I just don't mean high school. Adults, we're going to have an adult education program that gives them the training to be able to establish their own businesses or be qualified for better skilled and semi-skilled jobs that will allow them to generate enough income to sustain themselves and go forward and build and continue. 3, women, very, very important in going forward. We have to create a business environment in which small, medium, and large-scale businesses run by women actually get the capital support, they get interest rate support that allows them to grow so that they don't suffer from the traditional disadvantages that they would in the normal marketplace. And so we will have programs that will specialize in giving women the technical and financial support they need to grow their businesses. Then you come to specific communities like Linden. Linden is perhaps the most perfectly located region in the country. Vital goods and services to regions 9, 7, and 8 pass through Linden. Linden should become a logistics hub, a business hub to service those regions. And just to give you a practical example, a lot of people are in the mining industry. They travel all the way through Linden to Georgetown to get supplies. They should just go to Linden to get that. So we should, for example, have the national oil company Guyana set up a large tank farm in Linden so that will be the catalyst for other businesses moving their services that supply the dredging industry, supply the gold industry, and supply the forestry industry, all those industries that people pass through Linden and go to Georgetown for. So we want to cut out, all those trucks that are going to Georgetown to get service. They got to do that in Linden. The mechanics get more work. The electricians get more work. The hospitality industry in Linden will get more work because the truck drivers will need somewhere to stay while the vehicles get serviced and they turn around and go down, go back into the interior. And all that aggregate that they're moving down the road on trucks, they should move them by barge to Georgetown. So you come to Linden at the port in Linden, you discharge the aggregate onto the barge, and you move it to Georgetown. That saves a lot of the wear and tear on the highway that is in an awful state at the moment. It saves the wear and tear on the roads that actually get damaged in Linden at the moment, and for which Linden gets very little revenue. Again, with Linden, right now, most of the commercial lands in Linden are controlled by a state entity called NISA. The people in Linden should control those lands, and they should determine their own developmental program, and that should apply across the board. That shouldn't be limited to Linden alone. It should apply to Region 6, Region 5, 4, 3, any of those regions. We have this centralized system where the people in Georgetown think that they should determine the economic development plans for all the regions. That should change. That should not happen, because They, unless they're on the ground, they don't actually know what is actually happening in those communities. So now we want specifically for youth, and youth have always had a difficulty with accessing capital. So apart from a junior stock exchange, we want to be able to change the financial instruments so that it is easier for some young person with a commercially viable idea who may not necessarily have the financial resources to be able to take that idea from its germination stage to actual production by getting access to capital and getting investors. So those are just some of the programs that we would like to see.
Beautiful. We're speaking with attorney Nigel Hughes. In a few more moments we have with you, brother, today. I just want to throw out some questions here and give you the opportunity to, again, confirm this from your perspective or demystify them, smash them out of the way. A lot of things are said in the public space and are taken as fact. And I only pay attention to them and even give them some voice here because we know that as the people think, so they do. There's so much, we're in the age of information and misinformation. So I want to ask you to kind of address some of these things. Some of them might even be comical. Let's start. Oh, oil drilling. It's been said that Mr. Burnham was the oil, the great reserve that Guyana has had since the 70s. And he made a conscious effort to keep because in so many words, he looked over the oil producing world and asked if people could find one example of where the people would prosper from this. So there's one general conception, in my own words, that the oil drilling is a recipe for disaster, environmentally as well as financially. And that's why Burnham stayed away. And now we're running towards the disaster that some of our former leaders steered us away from. How does Nigel Hughes see that?
I think I think what Mr. Burnham, if you take Mr. Burnham's statement in contemporary circumstances, I think his warning was this, and this is how I take it. When you find oil, especially in large quantities, you begin to play in a different geopolitical game. It's a completely different game. You're no longer, some little country that's not a threat and not significant. You get pushed up into the big league. Now that sounds attractive, but it's no point getting pushed up into big league if you don't have the skills and talent to play in the big league. And that, I think, is really the warning that Mr. Burnham was giving. And what he was perhaps saying is, look, we know we have oil, but we're not ready to pay that game, because what happens is the battle is no longer yours. The concerns about the resources are no longer yours to determine. They are determined by forces outside of the country, and they're determined by forces you have very little influence over. I mean, if you ask the people of Iraq, what happened during that period? What happened during that period when there was the entire search for weapons of mass destruction was not of their making. That was not of their making. And so we have to be prepared. And I think the caution he gave is, look, don't get excited because you have billion-dollar US resources. What you need to be careful about is make sure you have the brains, the skill, and the ability to deal with the problems that come with billion-dollar resources. And that's got to do with world economic powers. It's got to do with geopolitical interests that override your national interests. We are sitting next door to Venezuela that has very close relations with China, Russia, Iran, and the United States is very nervous about that. So if that battle gets fought way above our head, our interests are not going to be the primary concern there. It's going to be a different scenario. And I think that was the caution that Mr. Burnham was alerting us to. Not that we shouldn't enjoy the benefits um, of our resources, but understand that oil is a special kind of resource that carries special kinds of consequences.
And I think you've answered it in a certain way, but I want to ask you this anyway, in a more direct way. Do you feel that the government has is the present government is prepared to play that game? And then the second part is, how would your government play the game different if this present government has not lived up to the standard? Has
Sure. I don't think, I mean, the short answer to the first question is whether this government has handled it well. I don't think they have. I think they appreciate that it's not a kid's game. But the first thing you try to do when you know that you're playing outside of your league is that you have a united domestic front trying to approach the issue of oil and its exploitation, and that you don't go on your own without the support of the rest of the country. This government only enjoys 50% support in the country. And therefore, when it goes out internationally, everybody knows that it speaks only in behalf of itself. And it is already demonstrated by its actions that its only interest is to hustle and make money. And it has very little interest in the nation. What I would do, certainly in relation to oil, if and when elected, is first of all, we have to have a national 10 to 15-year plan on oil, agreed by all political parties, about how that's going to be exploited, how we're going to manage this, and how we're going to approach the people who are in the industry. So at least let's have a consensus position that is national about how we deal with this resource and how we address the international community. That, I think, is particularly important and certainly is fundamental to our process going forward. We have to have that. Otherwise, it makes it exceedingly easy for anyone to come in and attempt to separate and divide us. So we have to have some sort of national position and consensus on the exploration and development of oil, particularly in relation to our partners in the international arena. That is one of the fundamental differences for me in approach.
good. Another popular opinion these days: Chinese people are taking over the country with impunity. They have been given advantage over the average Chinese person in terms of economic fitness.
Sorry, I missed that.
Another popular opinion is that Chinese people
Uh-huh.
are over the country, kind of a cultural imperialism, and that they are given unfair advantage comparative to the average Chinese person to have a strong economy. Would you agree with that or disagree?
No, I think one has to put a little bit more research and analysis. So the different levels of Chinese investment. Recently, there has been an outcry, or I should say there's a expression of concern, excuse me, in relation to the number of Chinese grocery stores that are popping up throughout the country. They're killing off your mom and pop stores. Excuse me. Particularly in the country, stores that have been there, family stores that have been there for a long time, are being literally run out of business by Chinese enterprises. And let me just deal with that. What's happening there is that the Chinese businesses are getting money at infinitely lower interest rates from the Chinese government or Chinese financial institutions than your mom and pop store who are borrowing in Guyana at 11 and 12%. So to start with, they are at a competitive advantage of at least 8 to 10 points on the dollar when it comes to business. Two, most of the manufactured goods that are being sold in these stores come from China. So whether as a result of their familiarity with the manufacturers or the distributors in China, they are probably getting better rates, better prices than if the mom and pop store was buying directly from China, or whether the middleman was sourcing from China and is then selling back to the people in Guyana. So on those two levels alone, the Guyanese business investor, mom and pop stores, are already 8 to 10 points behind the Chinese competitor who's coming in at that level. And that is an unfair economic advantage. We can't do anything about the fact that they're getting money cheaper, but there are other ways in which you can address it. And it needs to be researched to see how you can address it, because you don't want to be perceived as being hostile to foreign investment, but at the same time, if your foreign investor is perhaps getting an unfair advantage, you need to be able to address it. So that deals with that. The other part of it is on the larger scale, the forestry concessions and the other concessions, and the contracts that don't go out to tender, that may be sole sourced to Chinese company. There has always been some allegation of corruption. Excuse me. I got a bad flu. Yeah, there's always been some allegation of corruption or some sort of undue influence that has come about. There are a couple of things that are happening. The fact is, globally, the Chinese are perhaps offering not only financing, build, operate, and build, operate, turnover projects at far more competitive pricing than anybody else, and that's not a Guyana issue. That's happening globally. I think the Western world has been attempting to respond to that. So what happens is that the kind of port development you may get, infrastructural development that you get, coupled with the financing that China is offering, makes it very attractive to countries like Guyana. And so you will find that a lot of the hotels, the roads, the bridges, the larger bridges that are being done in Guyana go to Chinese companies, and quite often they perhaps don't necessarily follow the most orthodox of methodologies in the way they are identified, but that has been a problem. But those are the two principal areas, I think, in which people have had concerns or have heard concerns expressed.
One more question I have for you, then we'll just have some closing remarks here. I really appreciate you taking your busy schedule. Maybe today is a day in court. You were already in court this morning. I'm going to return to court. Speaking with attorney Nigel Hughes, attorney at law, um, uh, possibly attorney at war. Something that definitely time will tell, but your reputation definitely goes before you as someone who has definitely spoken up for many people who are in need. Uh, you mentioned Kissinger earlier, and I'm a farmer. I'm a farmer. My work is in agriculture and agriculture education. I truly feel that agriculture is the first culture. My father was telling me a story about how one of the pundit that was sent, I think, by the Nehru regime back in the days to Guyana, and some racist people tried to stop him up. And I kind of questioned, talking about what is the first culture, and he said agriculture is the first culture, because he understood where they were coming from. They were trying to deal with promote some kind of racial superiority. But Kissinger, that you mentioned earlier, once said that who control the food control the population. And this is not rocket science. This is not any deep mystical revelation. That's common sense. You mentioned something in Buxton that 30% of the children of Guyana are malnourished, and that is
Yeah.
heartbreaking. But one of the concepts, that's some of the backdrop for the people who are listening to my. One of the popular, I don't want to call it a myth, one of the popular opinions, I'm asking you to say if it's myth or if there's some truth to it, or it's falsehood or all true or whatever, is that the agricultural exploits of the African people in this country are being sabotaged by the government. They're being sabotaged by the government. Using my village, Buxton, as an example. I'm sure as a Guyanese you would have heard of Company Trent. So many different um, theories about why Company Trent is now dry, and there's so much to it. But I want to ask you, how would you address that? Is there any truth to that? Do you see any truth to someone who is involved in the day-to-day life of Guyanese and is now poised to be one of the leaders of a new Guyana,
Sure.
replacing this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think I've received more than sufficient reports from African farmers that there have been efforts to frustrate their development um, of their agricultural products, whether by flooding or not maintaining the drainage where their farms are located, obstructing their access of farm to market, making it more expensive for them to move products from where they are to market, and generally not supporting the drive. Having said that, I think the government's approach to agriculture does not is not in favor of agriculture. Let me put it this way: Gaisuko, Gaisuko is using some ridiculous amount of money per year, and we continue to put money at the tune of several billions of dollars per annum into what is a loss-making enterprise. So essentially, Gaisuko has become a social security. Sorry.
I need to cut you just to say, Guy Suko, for those who don't know, is the Guyana Sugar Corporation.
Yeah, it's a state-owned corporation. So that's the first problem with the approach to agriculture. Two, most people, and this is why there's always been a reluctance of people, young people especially, being interested in agriculture, think of agriculture as back-breaking. You're going into a field with a cutlass and a machete and long boots. That's not where modern agriculture is. Modern agriculture is not somebody picking up a machete and going into the fields. That's what Gaisuko does for sugar workers, that it keeps them in that condition. What we have to do in Guyana is that we have to identify the approach to agriculture that makes small and medium agro industries attractive. We get to standardize that agricultural product. The state assists in that standardization and the marketing of it. We can start with the Caribbean. They're importing 32 billion US dollars a year. So we need to look at in agricultural projects. So we just need to look at that. Pick a small figure, 5%. And we pick 5 years to be able to supply 5% of $32 billion. And we look at what it is. So if it is that they need all the plantains in a particular size or a particular food content, let the state assist the small and medium businesses in getting up to that production stage and sustaining it. One of the challenges Guyana has always had, and it's not limited to agriculture, but it's relevant in this context, is that we're good at getting the samples, but we're not good at the consistency. So somebody sees our samples, and the second they give us a 2 container per month order for peppers, we can't make it. So what is the gap in our production process that we can get that done? And most of this now is high tech. It's no longer 40 people going into a field with a machete or going into a shade house. It is highly scientific. It is very easily monitored, so you are likely to pick up the challenges early. And so the approach the government has and the image the citizenry have is Gaisuko, some man with a machete going to cut cane and throw it into a pond and it's got to go to the factory. That has changed. Our approach is, look, let us find, we've got a beautiful market in the Caribbean, $32 billion. Let's target 5% over the next 5 years, find out what we can best produce here in Guyana. Where are those arable lands that could produce that kind of product? Small to medium scale, if everybody gets a little 100 acres, the government says we will buy it once it's at this quality, and we take it straight to the Caribbean. And then after a while, you privatize what the government's doing, because by then you've built up the capacity in those businesses to be able to make it to the next stage. You've got to hold their hands initially, because that kind of capital investment in terms of the drainage, the dams, etc., the access from farm to market, the state's going to have to provide that initially, because no private investor is going to be able to do that and still make a profit. So that's where we need to go. This idea that the government has that we have to have 5,000-acre mega farms, I'm not sure that that's the best approach to agriculture, because what it does, excuse me, is all the government gets off of that is taxes. When you have a 5,000-acre farm, the amount of employment generated is very little, because most of that is mechanized. It's large combines going down, and they're generating the wheat, and the employment is very, very small. And all the government gets off of that is taxes. But it's going to spend a lot of money in the infrastructure, and it's going to say, hey, look at the numbers and the number of bushels of wheat or whatever we produce. We need to be a lot more targeted in the manner in which I just previously explained.
I mean, not to mention the whole aspect of climate change, which is something that is debated. Many people say it's not real. The global feels that, like they say, the axe forgets and the tree remembers. So the global south is feeling it even more and more. But one of the things that the United Nations even has declared for now is that small scale farming would be a more sustainable way to mitigate a lot of the climate change and many, not just the physical environment, but even the economic reality of the global south. And this is the world in general. So it's a very interesting conversation that we will continue to have. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us. We kind of touched and dabbed on a few different aspects of Guyanese life. Just to give the people a small introduction to Attorney Nigel Hughes, especially the people in the diaspora who are keenly aware, to a certain extent, I'm going to say who are somewhat aware, and we pray will be more keenly aware of what our home country. So before we let you go, any closing remarks, anything you would really like for the people of the Guyanese diaspora and just people in general, people of the world who mean good for the world in general, to know, to reflect on, or maybe even to act upon.
First of all, let me express my deep appreciation for affording me the opportunity to speak with your audience, a little bit about Guyana and what some of our plans are, and bringing to their attention some of the challenges we face. I want to say, particularly to the Guyanese diaspora, we are at a very fortunate place in time and history where we may just have enough resources with responsible management to actually build a real sustainable country. Excuse me. Going forward. We in Guyana can't do it alone. We need all the Guyanese in the diaspora and in Guyana to be able to achieve this. We need all the intellectual input, all the physical input, all the descendants of the Guyanese who may not be in Guyana, because we are a small population, and that is such an advantage that with proper planning. The flip side of that coin is that we become so drunk with this revenue that we have that we misspend it, we misappropriate it, we squander it, and we leave our children in great debt. And we will say, how could we have gotten it so wrong? So I invite all of you, please, let's come and make this Project Guyana work. We need your help, your assistance, your ideas. There's no divide. The fact that you are in the diaspora does not stop you from remaining an integral part of Guyana's development. And I thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Brother Attorney Nigel Hughes, presidential candidate of the Alliance for Change, attorney at war, attorney at law. Thank you so much for being with us. In reflection, I know that as you just mentioned, that 50% of the population seems to support this regime that is in power, regardless of all of the claims of mismanagement and degradation that it has poured upon the population. That seems to suggest that, again, to bring up the African wisdom, when spider webs unite, they can tie up a lion or even a dragon. So I trust that those of you in the as was symbolized on that stage in Boston on the 31st of August or 31st of July will really, take the opportunity to unite in functional ways, and do what we need to do to bring our people back to our place of dignity to this world. Thank you for joining
Thank you.
us.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Yeah.